Here's your fully paraphrased version while maintaining the original meaning and length. My sister wants to have her wedding on the same day and at the same venue as mine to cut costs, but there's no benefit for me in embarrassing her, even though she even wants to tag along on my honeymoon. Weddings are supposed to be joyous occasions, right? For most people, yes. But when you come from a fractured family like mine, things can become quite complicated. I'm 31 years old, and in just 2 months I'll be marrying the love of my life. We've spent over a year meticulously organizing our special day, and I was beyond thrilled as everything was falling into place. I'm marrying an incredible man, and my father, who has always been a pillar of support for me, insisted on covering most of the wedding expenses. He envisioned it as a grand celebration in an upscale venue, something truly extraordinary. Everything was progressing smoothly, but as is often the case in my life, my mother found a way to throw a wrench into things. Here's where it gets tricky. My parents split up when I was just 5 years old. Legally, the divorce was straightforward, but it created a rift in our lives that no custody agreement could ever mend. A year after the divorce, my mother remarried and had my half-sister, Bernie, who is now 23, with her new husband. Even though custody was shared between my parents, I spent the majority of my time with my father. My bond with my mother grew distant after she remarried, and matters only got worse when Bernie became the focal point of her life. I never held any bitterness toward Bernie, but it became painfully evident that my mother had moved on, and I had become an afterthought. Fast forward to today, my fiancé and I have been together for more than 5 years, and we finally decided it was time to tie the knot. When I shared our plans with my dad, he was overjoyed and immediately offered to assist us financially. I also informed my mom, and while she initially appeared pleased, things quickly took a turn. 3 weeks ago, out of nowhere, she called me. Since we don't usually speak often, I was surprised by the call. I assumed she wanted to check in, ask about wedding details, or maybe share in my excitement. However, I couldn't have been more mistaken. She began the conversation in an overly enthusiastic tone, something I've come to recognize as a warning sign that something unpleasant is coming. "Sweetie, I have fantastic news. Guess what? Bernie got engaged." I was caught off guard. I hadn't even realized Bernie was in a serious relationship. Given that we aren't close, it wasn't shocking that I hadn't heard about it. However, the way my mother presented it made it sound as though this was an expected event. I responded, "Oh, that's great. Congratulations." But deep down, I was puzzled. Why did she feel the need to call specifically to tell me this? I had no real interest in whether Bernie was single or engaged. Then, after a brief pause, her tone shifted to a more subdued one, and she continued, "So, here's the thing. Bernie and her fiancé are on a really tight budget, and they can't afford a big wedding like yours. So, we were thinking, what if Bernie and her fiancé get married on the same day as you? We could use the same venue, just a few hours earlier. Maybe Bernie could have a small ceremony in the morning, and then you could have yours later in the afternoon. It would save us a lot of money, and wouldn't it be special for the two of you to share the day?" I was stunned. My mother was essentially proposing that I share my wedding, the one I had spent over a year meticulously planning, with my half-sister, someone with whom I barely had a connection. I couldn't even begin to process it. Without hesitation, I responded, "Absolutely not. I won't let her take over my day. This is my wedding, Mom. It's not some family gathering or a budget-cutting strategy. I'm not sharing it with anyone, especially not Bernie." Her cheerful tone wavered, but she persisted. "Bernie and her fiancé really can't afford a big wedding. You have to understand how hard it is for us to not be able to give her the kind of wedding she deserves. It's just a matter of using the venue for a few hours. They'd only need a small section of the hall. It's not that big of a favor." She tried to justify her request, explaining that Bernie and her fiancé were struggling financially and that this solution would alleviate a lot of stress for them. I stood firm. "I'm sorry, but my answer is still no." She let out a long sigh and changed the topic, but I knew this wasn't the end of the discussion. Far from it. In the weeks that followed, my mother bombarded me with phone calls and messages, refusing to take no for an answer. Every conversation played out the same way, her pleading with me to let Bernie have her wedding on my special day, and me repeatedly shutting her down. She pulled out every manipulative tactic she could think of. First, she tried the sentimental approach. Wouldn't it be wonderful for you and Bernie to share such an important day? After all, she's your sister, I responded bluntly. We're not close, and I don't want to be. I came to terms with that a long time ago. Bernie and I will never have the kind of sibling bond you wish we did, and I'm fine with that. Then she became defensive. And whose fault is that? You're the older one. Did you ever even try to build a relationship with her? I didn't hesitate. No, I didn't, and I don't want to. When that didn't work, she shifted to guilt-tripping. You and your father have so much. Your wedding is going to be extravagant and beautiful. Don't you think it's a little selfish to keep all of that to yourself when your sister and her fiancé are struggling just to put something together? She doesn't even have stable employment, and her fiancé can't afford anything luxurious. Your stepfather can't help either. We're going through tough times. By this point, I was livid. First of all, their financial situation is not my responsibility. If she wants to get married without a steady job, that's her choice. But if they can't afford a big wedding, they should have a small one. It's completely unfair of you to ask me to share my special day. Since then, I've stopped answering her calls and messages, even the ones where she pretended to check in on my wedding plans. This entire ordeal has left me emotionally drained. The truth is, I put a lot of effort into rebuilding my relationship with my mother. As I mentioned before, she was absent for most of my childhood, and I harbored resentment for how quickly she moved on with her life. A few years ago, I worked through these feelings with my therapist, and it helped me grow as a person. I made the conscious decision to repair our relationship, and for a while it seemed to be improving. But after this latest situation, it feels like we're right back where we started. At this point, I honestly can't tell if I'm being unreasonable or simply standing firm on my boundaries. My mother keeps reassuring me that Bernie's wedding won't interfere with mine in any way, insisting that it will be finished before any of my guests even arrive. She also mentioned that their ceremony will be a small, intimate affair with fewer than 10 attendees. I truly appreciate everyone validating my feelings. You're absolutely right. Mending a broken relationship requires effort from both sides, and my mother's priorities are crystal clear. My happiness is not her concern. Her only focus is making sure her beloved golden child gets what she wants. Some people have asked why I feel so much resentment toward my half-sister, what led to this situation, and why she insists on having her wedding at the same venue as mine. Let me break it all down. I admit that I might come across as bitter or distant when talking about Bernie, but my feelings stem from past trauma. It pains me to revisit this, but my parents' marriage ended because my mother was unfaithful to my father, with Bernie's dad. I was just 5 years old, but some memories remain vivid. I clearly recall the day my father left our home, and only hours later Bernie's father arrived. That night my mother locked herself in her bedroom with him, while I cried myself to sleep. I have no idea how many days passed before my dad returned to see me, but when he did, I told him I wanted to go with him. At the time, he was staying temporarily with my grandparents, and he took me there without any objections from my mother. That was perhaps the one good thing she ever did for me. She used to visit frequently and would sometimes bring me back to her house, but she never forced me. I loved her, and every time she asked me to come with her, I hoped it meant she would finally prioritize me again. But that moment never came. Instead, she was preoccupied with being the ideal wife to her new husband, and before long she became pregnant with Bernie. I gradually spent more and more time with my dad, enjoying life with him and my grandparents. Not long after, my father moved into his own home just a block away from them. Eventually, he remarried, but that didn't happen until I was in high school. I have a great relationship with his wife. During high school, I lived with my grandparents full time, and by the time I went off to college, I had all but severed ties with my mother. My dad supported me financially through my studies and helped me establish my career. We have always been close, whereas my relationship with my mother has been, to put it mildly, strained. We exchanged texts occasionally and saw each other at family events, but the emotional distance was undeniable. Now, regarding my resentment toward Bernie, honestly, I struggle to put it into words. There was never a sibling bond between us. In that house, which was once my home, I was treated like an outsider. That place carried memories of my early childhood with both my parents, but it felt like Bernie and her father took it over. I never made an effort to build a connection with her and kept my distance instead. I don't know if that was my fault, hers, or both, but that's just how things played out. As for why Bernie insists on using the same wedding venue as me, I have no idea what makes her think it's appropriate to overshadow my special day. I truly don't understand. However, Bernie has always been the type of person who fixates on what others have and wants the same for herself. I remember countless times when she saw me with a new dress, doll, or toy, and she would pester her parents to buy her an identical one. The problem was her father didn't make enough money, so most of the time she ended up with a lower quality version of whatever I had. I don't mean to sound condescending, but that was simply the reality. So, maybe when she found out that I had chosen a beautiful lakeside mansion for my wedding, she decided she wanted the same thing. But unfortunately for her, neither she, her fiancé, nor her father could afford it. And that's where my mother came in, sent to negotiate on her behalf. After I turned my mother down, she secretly tried to manipulate my fiancé. Yes, she actually had the nerve to do that. She fed him the same sob story about Bernie's financial situation and begged him to let Bernie use our venue for her wedding as an act of generosity. She even suggested that we move our ceremony a little later in the afternoon so Bernie could have her ceremony in the morning. She assured him it would be a small event with only close family in attendance and promised that it wouldn't interfere with our plans. My fiancé is an incredibly composed person. He listened to her, expressed his sympathy, and told her he would discuss it with me. I'm grateful that he respected our boundaries and didn't make the decision on his own. When he told me about it, I was furious, but he quickly reassured me, saying, "This is your day, and if you don't want to share it, then we won't. I'll support whatever you decide." His words were exactly what I needed to hear. My mother had tried to drag my fiancé into her scheme, but I wasn't about to let that happen. I had reached my limit. I immediately called her and confronted her about her actions. I made it crystal clear that if she didn't stop her manipulative tactics, I would uninvite her from my wedding and cut her out of my life completely. She burst into tears, apologized, and admitted it was a mistake to contact my fiancé. She promised to change her behavior going forward. But the truth is, I don't want her apology. Deep down, I was hoping she would say something awful, because then I'd finally have a reason to disinvite her for good. After everything she did, I have no desire for her to be at my wedding. However, now that she has apologized, would it make me the bad person if I still cut her off and refuse to allow her to attend despite her apology? Just when I thought things couldn't possibly deteriorate further, I received an urgent call from my aunt. She's always the first to hear about any family drama, so I immediately knew something was wrong. Her first words were, "Have you seen Bernie's wedding invitation?" Puzzled, I responded, "No, I haven't gotten anything." That's when she informed me that Bernie had sent out invitations for her wedding, set for the exact same day and at the exact same venue as mine. People had already started asking her if it was meant to be a joint ceremony. Previously, my mother had assured me that Bernie's wedding would be a small affair with fewer than 10 guests. However, according to my aunt, the invitations had gone out to over 50 guests, plus their plus ones, all of whom were from our close-knit circle of family and friends. This meant that many of my relatives on my mother's side, who had already planned to attend my wedding, were now invited to Bernie's as well. It became painfully clear that Bernie intended to sabotage my wedding by holding hers first. I was thrown into a state of panic. What on earth was happening? The situation hit me like a punch to the stomach. Bernie had distributed invitations for her wedding on the same date and at the same location as mine without any prior discussion or agreement with me. Enraged, I got in my car and drove straight to my aunt's house, where I picked up a printed copy of the invitation. Filled with fury, I then went straight to my mother's house. The moment I saw her, I threw the invitation at her and demanded, "What is going on?" That was all it took for my mother to break down in tears. Through her sobs, she admitted, "I'm so sorry. Your stepfather and Bernie pressured me to convince you, but I wasn't able to get you to agree. I promised them I'd make it happen, and Bernie already sent out the invitations. I don't know what to do now." I was stunned by her audacity. She had committed me to sharing my wedding day without even consulting me. I sat there in disbelief, struggling to comprehend how she could make such a massive decision behind my back. But she wasn't finished yet. In one last desperate attempt, she pleaded, "Honey, now that the invitations have already gone out, could you please reconsider? Do this for me. I promised them it would happen, and if the wedding gets called off now, the groom's family and all our relatives will be embarrassed." My blood was boiling. As calmly but firmly as possible, I responded, "I've told you repeatedly that I'm not sharing my wedding day with Bernie. If they've already sent out invitations, that's their issue, not mine." My mother's wailing grew even louder, but I no longer cared. I made my stance crystal clear. She, Bernie, and their entire side of the family were no longer welcome at my wedding. I was exhausted from their manipulations. That was 2 days ago, and since then everything has been eerily quiet. This was supposed to be the happiest time of my life, yet here I was, dealing with chaos that should never have happened. Now for the update. I'm officially married. Thank you all so much for your support. After that final argument with my mother, I decided to get my father involved. I told him everything, and he assured me he would handle the situation. I also reached out to the wedding venue to inform them of what was happening. I made it explicitly clear that Bernie, my mother, and her husband were absolutely not permitted to enter the premises or attempt to organize any events there. The venue confirmed that only my fiancé and I had the authority to make any changes or reservations regarding our wedding. For a few days, everything was peaceful. I assumed my mother and Bernie were preoccupied with canceling their invitations and sorting out the mess they had created. However, not long after, my mother showed up at my house, looking completely drained. Her face was streaked with tears, and she appeared as though she hadn't slept in days. The moment I opened the door, she began shouting, "We've been humiliated. Bernie had to call everything off, and people are asking questions. Now we look like fools. Everyone knows we can't afford a decent wedding for Bernie. Have you humiliated us on purpose?" Bernie is devastated. She hasn't eaten in days. She and her father aren't even speaking to me. What did you gain from ruining my happiness? I folded my arms, staring at her without the slightest bit of sympathy. "I told you from the beginning that I wouldn't share my wedding day," I stated coldly. "You chose to ignore me, went behind my back and tried to force this situation. This is your fault, not mine. And yes, from now on you only have one daughter, Bernie, because I am done. I'm cutting you out of my life. I refuse to continue this toxic relationship. You and your family are no longer invited to my wedding." Before she could get another word in, I shut the door in her face. It wasn't my proudest moment, and part of me felt guilty about banning her from the wedding. But I needed to stand my ground and set a firm boundary. I told my father everything, and he stood by me 100%. He even offered to cover any additional security costs if necessary. He has always been my greatest source of support, and this time was no different. The fallout was immediate and ugly. My mother even attempted to involve my aunt, hoping she could persuade me to allow her to attend, but I stood firm. Despite all the turmoil, my wedding day was absolutely perfect. Here's your fully restructured and paraphrased version of the text, while maintaining the same meaning and length. I was surrounded by people who genuinely care about me. There was no tension, no turmoil, just pure love and joy. My father walked me down the aisle, and my husband and I exchanged vows in front of our dearest friends and family. It was everything I had ever envisioned. That day, my mother's absence didn't even cross my mind. If anything, it was her loss, not mine. I know some might say I was too unforgiving or that I should have compromised, but after enduring years of emotional detachment and apathy from my mother, I refused to sacrifice my own happiness just to appease her or anyone else. Bernie's wedding, on the other hand, had to be completely called off. They sent out formal notices apologizing to their guests, citing unexpected circumstances. My aunt later informed me that Bernie was both devastated and livid with me, though I fully anticipated that reaction. She holds me entirely responsible, as if I were the one who ruined everything. The reality, however, is that she never considered that she crossed a major boundary by distributing invitations without my approval, or that they tried to force me into accepting something I had made abundantly clear I did not want. In Bernie's mind, I was the one at fault. Apparently, she has withdrawn from nearly everyone outside of her immediate circle, too humiliated to face extended family or friends. Financially, the situation hit them hard. Since she and her fiancé were already struggling with money, the losses from the non-refundable deposits were a heavy blow. My aunt also mentioned that Bernie has been portraying me as the villain in this whole ordeal. In the version she tells, I'm the selfish sister who refused to share, even though I supposedly have everything, while she barely has anything. But rather than respecting my limits, they tried to exploit me, and now they're suffering the consequences. I've also heard whispers that this entire disaster has put a strain on Bernie's relationship with her fiancé. Word is, he was furious when everything fell apart. Apparently, he never wanted to take advantage of my wedding in the first place, but was pressured by Bernie into going along with it. He had a bad feeling about the whole thing from the beginning and was deeply ashamed when they had to call off the wedding. According to my aunt, things have been tense between them ever since. While they haven't officially broken up, it's clear that all this chaos has caused significant cracks in their relationship. Honestly, I'm relieved that Bernie's fiancé seems to be a reasonable person who understands that hijacking someone else's special day is completely wrong. Now, on to the latest development, which shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. Since childhood, Bernie has always been the type to covet whatever she saw someone else had. This time is no different. Recently, my mother found out that my husband and I were heading off on our honeymoon. Even though Bernie's wedding never happened, and therefore she wasn't having a honeymoon, she somehow decided that I should bring her along on our trip, as a way to make amends for the so-called harm I had done by ruining her wedding. Yes, you read that correctly. Bernie, who has barely any real relationship with me, believed that the least I could do was extend an invitation to her for my honeymoon. It sounds ridiculous, but it's true. Of course, my mother didn't reach out to me directly. She's blocked on every possible platform, including phone, social media, and email. But that didn't stop her. Instead, she called my father, attempting to persuade him to convince me. With absolute audacity, she told him that the least I could do was bring Bernie along. In her mind, this was the fairest way to compensate Bernie for the loss of her wedding and relationship. My father, who has been my rock through all of this, shut her down immediately. He told her, point blank, that this request was even more absurd than her previous ones. He refused to even consider pressuring me into taking Bernie on my honeymoon, and told my mother that the best thing she could do was stop making such outrageous demands. He also said something that struck me as completely on point. If she ever wanted a genuine relationship with me in the future, she needed to start treating me like her daughter rather than a resource for Bernie. He made it clear that her behavior was only widening the gap between us. When my father relayed all of this to me, I couldn't help but laugh. The entire situation was so ridiculous that the only way to respond was with humor. Naturally, I didn't give it another thought because there was no way I was bringing Bernie along. My honeymoon was a time for my husband and me, a trip we had planned to enjoy as newlyweds. I wasn't about to include anyone else, least of all Bernie. But the madness didn't stop there. Despite my father shutting her down, my mother completely disregarded his words. On the day of our flight, she and Bernie actually showed up at the airport. Yes, you read that right. They went to the airport. Thankfully, the airport is quite large, and my husband and I spotted them before they saw us. Thinking quickly, we managed to slip away before they could approach us. I doubt they had any idea which flight we were on or what time we were leaving. They were likely just lurking there, waiting to ambush us in the hopes that we'd let them come along. And that's not even the most insane part. Bernie actually brought a suitcase with her. She was fully prepared to board that plane with us. Now, consider this. If my mother and Bernie are struggling financially, what exactly was their plan? Did they assume I would buy them last-minute tickets to come along on my honeymoon? That was just yesterday. Today, my husband and I are already at our destination, fully enjoying our trip. All I can say is that I hope they had enough money for the cab fare home, because as far as I know, they were still waiting at the airport when our flight took off. Thankfully, that has been the extent of our contact with them. My husband and I are having the honeymoon we planned, exactly as it should be. Now that we're back, my husband and I joked about whether my mother and Bernie had been camped out at the airport this entire time, waiting for our return, like something straight out of a movie. We imagined them sitting there, just waiting to pounce, hoping for a free ride home as some kind of compensation for everything they believe we owe them. Of course, they weren't actually there when we arrived, but the thought of it still made me laugh. And now on to the latest stunt Bernie has pulled, not directly toward me, but something that could have a serious impact on me. She tried to flirt with my husband. Yes, because Bernie has always wanted whatever someone else has. And this time, she wasn't interested in just any husband. She wanted mine. Somehow, she even got his number. I'm not sure how she managed it, but she did. She has since been blocked on my husband's phone, though not before I had the chance to respond. She bombarded him with multiple messages, blatantly attempting to entice him. The content of these messages suggested things like, "If you ever grow tired of her, you could always upgrade to a younger version," or, "I get the sense she might be dull in bed, something I can assure you would never be an issue with me." To make matters worse, she included a few pictures that, while not entirely explicit, were undeniably provocative. Naturally, my husband ignored every single message, but I didn't. My response was straightforward. "Hey, Bernie, it's your sister." Your little scheme failed, and I think I know why. The pictures weren't exactly flattering. If you're going to try seducing another woman's husband, especially your own sister's, maybe hit the gym for a few months first, because you're looking a bit out of shape. I admit my response was cruel, and I fully acknowledge that making fun of someone's weight isn't right. I'm not proud of sinking to that level, but she pushed me beyond my limits. The sheer audacity of what she attempted left me feeling deeply wounded and betrayed, and in that moment, I allowed my anger to take control. I know some will view me as the villain for what I said, and I accept that, but I can't pretend it didn't feel satisfying at the time. Bernie has shattered boundaries I never imagined she would, and this is just another example of how toxic and manipulative she truly is. While I do feel a tinge of regret for how ruthless my response was, I also believe that sometimes you have to push back,